Hello, Jeff Dollar here. What you just heard was the first verse of the Huguenot battle hymn, Psalm 68, which opened the worship service at the French Protestant or Huguenot Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Recently, my wife and I have had the privilege of visiting this landmark of Protestant history. The remainder of the worship service is in English, but once a year they conduct a service entirely in French, in commemoration of their Huguenot heritage. Not many know much about the Reformation in France, or even if there was a Reformation in France, but it had taken root through the teaching of French theologian John Calvin. It was always dangerous to be a Protestant in France, but over time the church grew in numbers, strength, and influence. When the French Roman Catholic authorities attempted to stifle the church, civil war erupted. This dragged on for about 30 years, and in the midst of that, in 1572, came the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. This occurred at the instigation of Queen Catherine de' Medici and was a clandestine coup against the Huguenot economic, political, and military leadership. It really dealt a death blow to Protestantism in France. The Huguenots were told to renounce their Protestant faith and embrace the innovations of Rome, and they would be let free. They refused, and somewhere between 5,000 to 30,000 Huguenots were killed in 1 week. They feared God alone, worshipped Him only, and rested in Him alone for their salvation. 1598 marked the signing of the Edict of Nantes, signed by Henry IV, a former Huguenot who turned Catholic when he became king. This granted the minority Protestants certain rights and provided for toleration of their religious worship. This edict was revoked in 1687 by Henry's grandson, King Louis XIV, which gave rise to another mass exodus of French Protestants, many of whom sought refuge in the English colonies. They spread throughout the North American continent. We recently discovered that my wife, Mrs. Dollar, is a descendant from a smaller group of Huguenots which settled in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I personally believe that the persecution, murder, and expulsion of the Huguenots by the French authorities brought God's judgment upon France, most evidently seen in the bloody French Revolution. The salt and light of the French Protestants was no longer present to the degree that it had been to prevent the cultural rot which brought on the chaos of the French Revolution. The English colonies, however, had received these refugees and benefited from the positive Christian influence they brought with them, giving us the Christian foundation of our American government. So back to the church in Charleston. This information comes from their church's website. In April of 1680, the ship Richmond arrived in Charleston with 45 French Protestants, or Huguenots, aboard. More refugees followed, and in 1687 a church was built on what is now the corner of Church Street and Queen Street in downtown Charleston. About 450 Huguenots had settled in the low country of South Carolina by 1700. The original church was destroyed in 1796 in an attempt to stop the spread of a fire, which had burned much of the surrounding area. The replacement for the original building was completed in 1800 and dismantled in 1844 to make way for the present Gothic Revival edifice designed by Edward Bricknell White and dedicated in 1845. The church was damaged by shell fire during the long bombardment of the downtown in the war between the states and was nearly demolished in the severe earthquake of 1886. An interesting note, the church organ was dismantled by the Yankees after the fall of Charleston in an attempt to take it to New York, but the pleas of the organist and influential friends saved it. Another interesting and perhaps a bit morbid note, the present building had been constructed over part of the church's original cemetery, which remains under the floor of their sanctuary. The only way to see it is through a crawl space, but the stones there have been protected from the weather for nearly 2 centuries, or maybe more than 2 centuries, and they're in much better condition than most. I was not permitted in the cemetery because of insurance reasons. Also, if you happen to visit the church, just a reminder that there are no restroom facilities in the church. So come prepared, though they do have facilities a few buildings down at another property. Again, reading from their website, the Huguenot Church of Charleston is independent and is not affiliated with any governing church body. We see this as an advantage in a time of interdenominational strife. I would tend to agree with this, as I pastor an independent Reformed church in Pennsylvania, and though we would love to be able to have closer denominational connections, we do not wish to inherit the various contentions found within these groups. Back to the website, the church shares many historical links to the Presbyterian Church, the Church of Scotland, the Dutch Reformed, and Lutheran Church by virtue of its early leadership under John Calvin. Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, published in 1536, form the historic basis for the formation of these Calvinistic denominations. The French Huguenot Church is perhaps the least known among them. This may be attributed, at least in part, to the tendency of Huguenot immigrants in the American colonies to assimilate into their communities and their intermarriage into families who were practicing Anglicans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and so forth. So the Huguenot Church of Charleston is unique. It is a living remnant and reminder of the Huguenot experience here in South Carolina. And let me add to that any minority group, such as the French, the Germans, and others that have come to this country have been over the years assimilated into the English-speaking culture. Now, that, with the exception of that, I would say would be the Amish, who have separated themselves into their own communities and retained their semi-German, I guess you call it, language and culture. But for the most part, Europeans have melded together, and that's why it's difficult to find an ethnic European church in that sense that hasn't already been assimilated into the culture in some way. I was told the church in Charleston is the only remaining independent French Protestant church in the United States, or actually in the American Hemisphere. It still retains the same liturgy of worship and doctrine as the early Huguenot settlers. Despite no longer speaking French, they have struggled over the years to retain their French Reformed heritage. And finally, this church is a reminder of the great Protestant and Calvinistic influence that was present at the founding of our country and laid the foundation of our religious freedom. The English separatists and Puritans brought with them the dedication and love for the Scriptures, just as the French did, and saturated early America with Christian principles that formed the fiber of our Christian culture. This has since been lost in the past several generations, but if we are to regain it, we must return to the doctrine and practice that gave it birth. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section. I may also be contacted by email. And the Lord bless you in your search for truth.
God shall arise and by his might put all his enemies to flight. In conquest he shall quell them. Let those who hate him scattered flee before his glorious majesty. For God himself shall fell them. Just as the wind drives smoke away, so God will scatter the array of those who evil cherish, as wax that melts before the fire. So vanquished by God's dreadful ire, shall all the wicked perish. But let the just with joyful voice in God's victorious might rejoice. Let them exalt before